Plugin of the week is the brainworx BX rooms. I'm not sure how you would pronounce that. rooM. The idea there you see with the capitals is very important because, like many of the brainworx plugins, they do all kinds of really, really cool, amazing MS-style processing. It's sort of a signature of theirs, and it's no different here with this reverb. So what I want to show you through this reverb plugin is some of the amazing and really unique settings that kind of go along with this. And so essentially what you have here, I'm just going to zoom in on the display. We'll get right to it. The brainworx is you can select between a bunch of different reverb types. So you have 5 selections, ambience, rooM, plate, hall, church. You get 3 different sizes, small, medium, large. So these are common things that you would see like on a good starting point type of things for a lot of, especially like digital reverbs, rack-mounted digital reverbs, where you get like these basic settings as starting points, and then you can kind of adjust accordingly. And as always, basically gives you like a good preset setup here. You also have a wet-dry control, so you can place it on the insert of a track or in a send-return configuration like I have it here. You have a gain in and a gain out, so that determines how much level goes in and out. There's some unique controls here, which we'll get into as we go along. There's a reverb parameter selection allowing you to control, or section, excuse me, involving reverb time, rooM size, and rooM shape. We'll get into that parameter. Some damping for the reverb time, which is very important. Pre-delay, and then a very cool feature called source distance. And you'll kind of see that, but essentially what this does is it takes the input signal and pre-delays the input signal. And also as you go farther away, what ends up happening is that you also get, in addition to that delay, it also kind of warms up the top end. And so what you get a sense is that the sound with a lot of reverb is coming from more of a distance or farther away from you. And that can kind of add like a subtle, very cool effect, as you'll see. In the effects section, there's some really cool features here. The directivity, this is basically a control where essentially what the basic plugin is 2 mono reverbs that are discretely left and right. And when you have it set to the true setting here, then left feeds left and right feeds right, as you would normally do it. As you pull it towards the center, essentially what you're doing is you're summing the inputs more for a mono-ish kind of thing, feeding, so you have the 2 separate reverbs, and then you have on the reverse side, left feeding right and right feeding left. So we have like an inverted thing. So it defaults to the true stereo. So this way, if you put something on the left-hand side, you'll get predominant center of reverb on that side. There's also a modulation section for modulating the reverb tail. There's a quantize section, which is very cool. So you can shift it down to more vintage digital reverbs, which were down as low as 8-bit. So this gives you the ability to kind of grid it up a little bit, which is kind of cool. And then perhaps one of the coolest features of the plugin here is the equalization section and the MS section. So with the MS section, you have a width control, and then you also have the ability to pan the mono signal, which is kind of cool. So you can actually move the mono signal over. So this can correct, sometimes with reverberant energy, you may get a shifting of the imaging, of the center imaging. It also helps you to compensate for some things where maybe you're feeding a guitar in, it's mostly to the left, but you're getting more center-centric reverb results. So you can actually take the main, like mono signal, move it over closer to where the guitar is, and then you get more strength or power over where the guitar is feeding in. And so that can kind of give you some really cool things as well. Also, taken from some of the other BX collection plugins is the mono maker. And what this does is it allows you to mono up the low frequency reverb. So this is part of a lot of their MS processing, MS style processing, mastering. So what this does is it monos up the reverb on the low end. So sometimes if you feel like it's becoming too muddy or anything like that, you could sort of mono and focus it in closer to maybe the kick drum or the bass or whatever is kind of driving the primary energy going in. And in addition to this, there's also an EQ. So you have a high frequency roll-off and a low frequency roll-off up here. And they're pretty broad, so you can go up to 30K on the high pass filter, which is pretty crazy. And then you can go up all the way down here to 20 hertz on the top end. So this gives you a lot of control. You can also change to a sharper Q there, going to a second order noise filter on the top or a bottom. So that gives you options, or just turn it off altogether. And here you have 2 full parametric EQs that go from low shelf to peaking parametric. That's more like a like an API where it actually gets narrower as you go up or boost more. So all of a sudden the words are escaping me for what that is, but it'll come back to me. And then you get frequency control here. So you can go everything from shelving to a wide bell to a narrow bell. And so you have that for high and low end. What's really cool about this is that in addition to turning it off, you could process only the mid signal, only the side signal, or the whole MS signal, which means that you could apply the EQ to EQ a characteristic into the center or into the sides without affecting anything else. And I'll show you some really cool ways in which that is really helpful. So let's get back, put some sound through this, and let's just kind of go through some of the basic parameters. So what I have is some drums that are feeding into this. And just so we can kind of, just so you can get a sense of what it is. So maybe what I'll do over here is just focus here on the bass, and then so we can get this. Not everything is feeding into it, but you can get a sense of the space itself. So let's go through some of the basic reverb types. Ambience. rooM. Late. Probably vocals are a better fit for something like this. So I think we probably should focus on either an ambience or on a rooM characteristic. All right, let's work with this with a large ambience. I kind of like this, and let's kind of work with some of the basic settings here. So if we start here, one of the main things that we can work with is the reverb time and the size of the space. They do affect each other. So as I increase the reverb size or the rooM size, what I'm going to get is a bit more reverberant energy, or a bit, you know, you'll get the sense of a bigger space, which will add to the sort of sense of lengthened reverb time. So essentially the size, what it does is it takes the early reflections that come back later. The bigger the space, the longer it takes for those first reflections to start to come back to the center. And then the smaller you go, the more it will create a coloration in the sound, and the farther you go away, you could start to hear it separate. There's also a very cool feature called the rooM shape. And essentially what this does, if you kind of go down here to the bottom setting, you're getting something that almost sounds a bit more gated and shut down. And so the ART is for artificial. So I kind of like that basic setting and length. And now let's move on to some damping here. So if we want a damping, what we can do is set a frequency here. I can kind of warm up. Now this is like, damping is essentially, unlike EQ, damping is coloring or tonally shaping the frequency response of the reflections. So that means that you're basically changing or making less density in high frequencies, the more that you are pulling back here. And then this sets the frequency that you're starting from. So in other words, it's kind of like a roll-off, but of the frequency content of the reflection. So it's different from the EQ. Think of it more like how much high-frequency absorption would be in a space versus mid-range reflectivity. And so you're changing that. So in other words, if we keep this wide open with no cut, you're getting something that is much brighter, probably more tile-like. Right, whereas you go downward, then you start to get more stone to brick, where it starts to get a bit more diffusive, but warmer down to wood and that type of tone. So you could do it on that end. You could also do it on the low end. Which takes away a bit of the power in this particular case. So I'm just going to kind of leave that alone. So I'll leave it pretty close to what the default settings are. I can actually option click to get the basic default setting, but I'll leave it with this default. It was like 1.5, so we'll kind of leave it there. The next one I want to go through is pre-delay. Pre-delay determines the distance from the the amount of time it takes before the onset of reverb. So essentially what happens is the sound, if the closer the sound is to you generally, then the longer it will take relatively, because you're closer to the original sound source in terms of maybe where you were standing in the room and there's a drum kit that's right in front of you, you're getting the direct sound pretty immediately. And if you're in a big space, it will take longer for the reverb in that space to accumulate and get towards you. So that's kind of what the pre-delay would be. Something along those lines. And it can be a really cool way of separating the dry signal from the wet signal. Whereas at 0, what you have is something that is almost attached to the dry sound. And this will give a sense of a little more size, just a little bit big. But you can hear the detail and subtlety. Now, a nice kind of tie-in to this is the source distance. Now, this is a little more subtle, but you get a sense of what's going on here. So the basic idea of this, and you can hear the kind of warming effect of the input signal going into the reverb. The idea is you're getting some form of a delay. This is obviously not in milliseconds because you would hear a flam at that point or a slapback at that point. But what ends up happening is that if you have like that same drum kit and it's on the opposite side of a room, a very big room, then what happens is the reverb, the direct sound is going to be warmer by the time it gets to you, and the reverb is going to arrive at a very similar time. That would be the general characteristic. So traveling over that distance, you would lose some high frequency response. And what this does is it has a tendency, which is a really, really cool way of sort of softening or adding a more subtle effect to the sense of the reverb depth, and which I really like. It's very cool. So. And I'm going to kind of go with that. I like what that's doing better than the high frequency roll off or the dampening that's over here. So that's kind of cool. So let's move on to some of the other directivity things. This we may not hear a whole ton, but let's just go just because most of what's feeding into this reverb is coming from the center. But we'll. So this is inverting the left-right feeds. And this is more monoing it up. Right, so you get more openness here, more density here. And again, back to more openness, but the level this you would hear more if you had, say, for example, a good way to use this might be having a guitar on one side and you sort of want the reverb, you want to get the sense of space, but when you put it on the same pan field, it just, you can't get it to sort of sit right. You could pan it over to the opposite side, have the reverb come from the opposite side, and especially if it's balanced with another guitar, hard left and right, you can get that sense of depth that comes from across the room, and then it all kind of balances off. Very, very cool. There's also a modulation thing in here. It's not an uncommon thing to put modulation effects on reverbs, like you've probably heard of like flanged reverb effects and things like that, and it's not really on that level or going for that type of characteristic, but what it does is it creates some undulating movement, which can sometimes bring in character or a shape to a reverb, so it's maybe not so linear. That's the basic idea. So for different examples, maybe with a vocal, the character of that may come out a little bit more. Let's go over the quantize section. So there's a simplicity with this that sometimes works really well. A lot of the it's amazing to think that a lot of the real early digital reverbs were all 8-bit and they really sounded amazing. There's sort of a simplicity. What you start to lose, obviously, is the high definition detail. Usually they're a little bit, they're less dense because you're picking up less of the characteristic and detail of the sound. But it's kind of an interesting characteristic, and that maybe alone on something like just the claps or something like that might be a really cool effect to bring character in. Let's go over some of the MS settings here. Otherwise, this will go on forever. So we have a width control. Up to a 400%. Or we can mono it up. This is a very cool way of kind of taking and balancing out the spread of the reverb itself. You can also take the center signal and so you could hear like the main body of the clap reverb off to the left, off to the right. And this is basically, I'm used to just to show you the extreme. It's like where the most density of the energy is coming from. And you could take that mono signal and pan it. So it's a little talked about mid-side thing where sometimes one of the cool things about MS processing is sometimes where the mix is sort of off-center a little bit, but the left-right is actually dead on, you know, like balanced, and you want to shift the center imaging a little bit, you know, left or right, or just to kind of rebalance it or to recenter it without affecting what's going on the side signals. And essentially that's what it's doing, but it's doing it with the reverberant energy. Then there's also the mono maker, and what this does is it takes signals below the selected frequency, and what this does is it monos it. And the thing is, it can go all the way up to 22K, so that's mono reverb. And the idea there is if you're getting some kind of muddiness, or you can kind of focus something in, like if you had some kick energy in there and it was maybe a little too boomy in the room, you could kind of mono it up, get past that fundamental, so the reverberant energy down in that area sort of monos up and kind of ties a little bit more neatly to the kick drum without creating a big muddy mess. So that's a very cool feature to kind of add in. Very extremely unique. Nobody has anything like that. You would have to do it as a separate processor and call up a BX plugin basically to do that. So then on the EQ side, you have high pass, low pass filter. I think this is can be basically applied to the process signal, you know, or to the original signal. And so the primary difference is that are you applying the equalization to the signal feeding the reverb, or are you applying the signal to the reverb itself, the EQ to the reverb itself? So here, what I can do here, I just want to show you something that's really cool, because you could do like normal equalization in terms of the overall thing, but I want to show you something here where what we can do is we could take and we could spread some of the high frequency energy here, but we'll only apply this EQ to the side signal. Right, so we can add that to the high end without really, you know, kind of messing with anything else. If we wanted to, we could find sort of the fundamental of the clap, which is probably somewhere in that 200, right? And then let's proportional Q, that's what it is. We're picking up some tones in there somewhere, which is kind of cool. Sometimes you can kind of create like a unique character. Like maybe I just apply this to the mid signal. And I add a little bit more mid density. This could sometimes work really, really well for working with like a vocal where you're trying to bring some warmth into the vocal. So you can kind of EQ in like a warming area for the vocal, but it's not attached to the vocal. So it adds the warmth without creating mud in the dry signal. This can happen a lot for very thin, you know, people who sing too much from their throat or their head voice, and then they're singing into like a condenser mic. And you know, it's not enough proximity or warmth to kind of balance it off. You could get a shrill kind of sound. That's a really great way of kind of balancing out some of that stuff. And again, you could apply this EQ to the mid, to the side, or both to the mid and side, or just turn it off if you don't like it. So I'll just kind of leave that off for the time being. Oh, actually, let me put it on for a second. And then let's just leave it on the mid signal. And then I want you to hear what the effect of this is when you apply it to the dry signal or to the wet signal. Now, this is the dry signal feeding into the reverb, okay? So this would be the original. I'm sorry, that would be that. Right, so you can see sometimes like EQing the source feeding into the reverb makes a bigger difference, but that's kind of a nice little characteristic to throw in on top of that. So you can see there's just like tons of ways to kind of go with this. Very cool. You got a wet dry control. There's a fixed mix thing, which just allows you, if you have a particular wet dry setting and you go through some presets, what'll happen is it may flip to wet, so that will lock it in so it won't change. And then you could have a wet solo, so that just kind of fixes that in. You have input and output gain. The bypass in control allows you to mute the signal that's feeding the input of the reverb. I think the basic idea of this is when you apply the plugin on an insert and you're using the mix, wet-dry mix for the reverb, this would give you the ability to mute effectively the send feeding the input of the reverb without muting the direct or dry signal. That's the basic idea there. So it would be the equivalent of muting a send that would be feeding a reverb return. That would allow you to make, like, say, take a single word at the end of a phrase and make it dry, whereas everything else was wet. The bypass out is the opposite. This would be the equivalent of muting the output of the reverb without muting the dry signal that's passing through. So again, if you have the signal on the send, you would also have the ability to bypass the dry signal. The difference between this is that the reverb unit itself is actually still generating reverb, but the output of the reverb is muted. So that's a little bit different. So that would be the equivalent of muting the return of the reverb if you were in a send return configuration. Anyway, I hope that makes sense. A little bit confusing, but this is an amazing one. Really, really great plugin, a great addition to the Plugin Alliance collection from brainworx. And it is the plugin of the week, the brainworx BX rooM MS. Again, I'm still not sure exactly how to to pronounce that, but BX rooms, plugin of the week.